Okay, so it's me again, another video. Maybe I'm taking this too far, but I don't know. I kind of felt that there was something missing. There was still something missing in terms of the previous video, so I decided to do some slides. So you might, and at the same time, me too. I feel that this is too much information, but back from my college days, I've always known that too much information is better than too little information. Too little information. And so I created animation. It's no big deal. Didn't take me too long. And so in this training or whatnot, I'm gonna try to define where the lingo comes from and why is it that that one. So one of the purpose of the video is where the lingo comes from. Where is it that they derive it? What does it mean? And the other part is why the engine is still not interchangeable. I know everybody's probably like, oh, okay, it's not interchangeable, but still, kind of show why. But at the same time, it helps because you understand the lingo. So maybe you're talking to a mechanic or some guy, you kind of sound fancy, because you could throw words at them as well as they throw them at you, because I guess that's how us geeks, motor guys are. So anyways, here we go. So here we have a cylinder, and here we have a piston, right? So as you know, the piston goes up and down. Now, the piston, the highest point that it can travel is called the top dead center, right? And so here we draw a little line, and then the piston goes down. Now that's the farthest down that the piston goes, and that we refer to as bottom dead center. And so the distances between those two is what's actually referred to as a stroke. So if you hear somebody call a stroke, that's what it means. It's just the distance that the piston travels all the way from the top to the bottom. Nothing special. And so the bore is the actual the diameter of the cylinder, right? So it's that simple, right? But anyways, let's just keep going, so we can understand a little bit more. So let's just move this to the side. And so now, let's suppose you have a cylinder, right? And so this is just like any cylinder, right? You learned about this in algebra, right? In school, and you're back in the old days. And so, like any cylinder, it has a height and it has a radius. And it turns out that one of the formulas to calculate the volume is this. And so every cylinder has a volume. And so volume is a unit of measurement. Now, stretching this a little bit further, let's suppose we wanted to measure this volume right here, this from the piston, right? So from the stroke, the bore, it creates a cylinder. Yeah, so it creates an actual cylinder, right? And let's suppose we wanted to measure that volume, right? And so the radius would be, in terms of the lingo from an engine, the radius is the bore divided by 2, right? Because the bore is the diameter, and we're only interested to do the calculations for the volume. We only need the radius, and so that would explain the divide by 2. And of course, the height of this cylinder would be the stroke, right? And so with that, we can find the formula to calculate the volume for the engine, for the piston, for the cylinder, right? And so that would be that formula if we wanted to calculate it, right? And so let's get that out of the way. Let's just move this. So now comes the part. So this is pure algebra, right? This is displacement. And so, but in the engine, in a MerCruiser engine, it's a 4-cylinder engine, right? And so we have 4 cylinders, 4 pistons, right? And so if you want to calculate the total volume, you just multiply it by 4 essentially, right? And that gives you the total volume. Now, in terms of engines, we actually call it, this total volume, we actually call it displacement. So it turns out that displacement is nothing more than the calculation of the volume of what can be calculated as a piston goes up and down. That small little space that each piston has. So you hear a lot about this in engines. You say 4.2 liter, 4.8 liter, 5.3 liter. That's what it actually means. So this, we just happen to calculate it. We're calculating for an inline 4. But the same formula, the same methods, you actually use it to calculate it for other engines. What is it? The Mustang, the 4.2, 5.0. That's essentially what it means. So it's the displacement. So displacement is nothing more than volume, right? So let's just move this to the side. Okay. So now we're actually gonna do a comparison. So of the MerCruiser and the Super-Thrift. That's how it's called, right? From the Impala slash Opala Chevy 2 Nova, right? And so we're going to do a comparison to show that, A, where the numbers come from, where all this lingo comes from, and B, why they're not interchangeable, why it's technically a different engine, right? Technically the same engine, but technically a different engine. And just as a reminder, that would be the bore, and that would be the stroke, right? And so the name, again, for the engine is MerCruiser 3.0 liter. Now, with the information that we just learned, I'm going to define where the 3.0 liter comes from, right? And so in this engine, if you look at the specs for the MerCruiser, it specifically tells you that the stroke is 3.6 inches, right? And by the way, inches, especially back in those days, the stroke, they would call it in inches. And I don't know if it's still the same case with the new cars, but at least in the old cars, they would specify it in inches. And the bore for the MerCruiser, it's 4 inches. 4 inches. Again, this is in the specs. It clearly states it. That's what it is. So if you actually put these numbers, plug these numbers into the formula that we just derived, and the one that's in the bottom left, 4 times pi times the stroke. By the way, I know that the pi and the stroke is reversed, but the formula algebra for the algebra rules lets you do that, so it really doesn't matter. So maybe I flipped it, but it's still the same thing. The answer is the same thing. So anyways, 4 times the stroke, which is 3.6, times pi, times the radius, which is the bore, divided by 2, which is 4. That's the bore. Squared, it gives you the displacement, right? And so if you plug in the formula, it equates to 181. And it turns out, since we're talking about the stroke is 3.6 inches and the bore is 4 inches, then that actually means 181 cubic inches, right? And so, and it makes sense, 3.6 inches, this inches squared, so that's where the cubic comes from, right? So the 4, it doesn't have any value, no number, no. You know what I'm talking about, right? So this is inches, inches, inches. So you have 3 inches. That's where you get the cube from. And so, but it turns out that it's also 3 liters. Well, it turns out that cubic inches and liters are units of measurements to measure volume. So just like you convert from the English system to the metric system, cubic inches and liters is just another way of measuring volumes. So you can convert from one unit of a measurement to the other one. So it means the same thing, right? Except, if I'm not mistaken, in the United States, they talk a lot about cubic inches. And in Europe and Japan and the rest of the world, right? And so that's where it comes from. So the MerCruiser 3.0 liter, that's where that 3.0 stands for. That's where it comes from. So it's the actual displacement, and we just derive where that number comes from. But at the same time, they could have called it MerCruiser 1.81 cubic inch, right? And so that's gonna make sense right here. Now, in terms of the Super-Thrift, the 153, that's kind of confusing. And so watch how. So the MerCruiser, that's the name, MerCruiser 3.0. But the Super-Thrift is called Super-Thrift 153. The names don't even look similar, right? Much less the 153 and the 3.0. Well, again, so on the specs, more into that right now, right? In the specs, it says that it has a stroke of 3.25 inches and a bore of 3.875 inches, right? And so the displacement, if you plug in these numbers into the formula, 4 times the stroke, which is 3.5 inches, times pi, times, what is it, the radius, which is 3.875 inches divided by 2. That would give you the radius squared. If you plug into the formula, it gives you 153. Now, 153, we know it's cubic inches because, again, 3.25 inches and 3.875 inches squared. So we know this means cubic inch. And again, if you put this in an online calculator, online converter, you'll know that this equates to 2.5 liters, right? And so this means the same thing. It's just another way of expressing it. One is the English system, and the other one is the metric system. And so the $1 million question is, why is it that sometimes the specs, they describe it in terms of liters and sometimes they describe it in terms of cubic inches? Well, the answer is simple. Back in the old days, American car companies, they weren't global. They were just national. So, but nowadays, you have Ford and what is General Motors, they sell them internationally. So now they're global. And as we learn in grade school, basically the United States is almost the only country. Yeah, there's other small countries, but it's basically the only large country that still use the English system. Every other country, including England, changed to the metric system. And so that's why, if you notice, the name Super-Thrift 153 is just a relic from back in the old days that they used to use cubic inches. Even 350, a lot of people have heard of the engine, the 350 engine. That's what the 350 stands for. It's the displacement, 350 cubic inches. And so it's just the changing times, that American companies, now they're global and they're trying to standardize, and so they're joining the bandwagon, so to speak. And regardless, if you Google online, like if you look at it online, sometimes they actually call the Super-Thrift, they call it the Super-Thrift 2.5 liter. So even that, they're changing the name. I don't think I've seen, let me see, MerCruiser 181. I haven't seen that, but I have seen the Super-Thrift 2.5. And so it's just American car companies, just joining the bandwagon. And so that's why the lingo, the naming convention back in the days was cubic inches, and now it's liters. And so now you kind of know where the lingo comes from. So if in case someone tells you, you can understand. And this can be applied to other engines as well, by the way. And so that's where the lingo comes from. Okay, so now the extra stuff to, if I didn't drive it in before, I think I will now. So as you can tell, the stroke is different and the bore is different from both engines. The MerCruiser is 3.6, and the Super-Thrift is 3.25. So if you try, so first let's talk about the bore. More better the bore. Bore from the MerCruiser is 4 inches, and from the Super-Thrift is 3.875. Now, what do you think is going to happen if you try putting a piston from a MerCruiser to a Super-Thrift? It's not going to fit. It's not going to fit. And if you do vice versa, then there's going to be a lot of blow-by. If you put the Super-Thrift, 3.875 inch piston, by the way, that's not the official size. It's a little bit smaller, but still. So if you try putting it in the MerCruiser, you're going to have a lot of blow-by. It's going to be like loose. So the pistons don't fit. We know that for a fact. And what about the stroke? The stroke is different. And so I know to get a bigger stroke, what you do is you put a bigger crankshaft, and now you have a stroker engine. So what do I mean by a bigger crankshaft? The distance between the main bearings, the main journals, and the rod journals, it's bigger. So that way the piston can go higher and it can travel lower. A difference in top dead center and bottom dead center. But technically speaking, and whenever that happens, then you have a stroker engine. And so is the MerCruiser stroker engine from the Super-Thrift? And I know that the transition wasn't directly from the Super-Thrift to the MerCruiser. I know that there was an in-between transition with the Opala. So if you look at the Wikipedia page, they actually also tell you that they changed the connecting rod distance from the Super-Thrift to the Opala. It's not the same rod, connecting rod. It's a different connecting rod, at least from the Super-Thrift to the Opala. And I don't know, from the Opala to the MerCruiser, I don't know if they kept the same connecting rod. And so this is on top of everything. So it's a gamble. I mean, if it was like a standard engine where everybody used it, like the 350, there's a enormous documentation in terms of people experimenting with it, but not in this case. Again, with all this knowledge, do you really want to risk switching parts and interchanging parts? I wouldn't. I mean, you can, and maybe you might have success, but just the rarity of the engine, not a lot of people have. If you notice, like, you really can't find that much information on these things, on these engines. And so you really can't know if people did this and interchange parts. And so, because there's not that much information, I just wouldn't risk it, And so, let me see, am I missing anything? So anyways, so hopefully you know the lingo, where the lingo comes from, where the name comes from, the differences between them, and why they're not interchangeable. So, again, oh man, I should put like a fiend again. Thank you for watching, and I don't know, people always say subscribe. I'm still new to this, so subscribe. I don't know what exactly I get or what I don't get, but anyways, so hopefully now you know where the lingo, where the names comes from, the lingo, and the differences and the similarities. And again, you can apply this to other engines. Thank you, and bye.